Welcome to the tutorial on the Belmont Forum Data Management Plan Scorecard. The scorecard is designed to assess data management plans for the Belmont Forum following the DDOMP. Just a brief review of the open data principles. Data should be discoverable through catalogs and search engines, accessible as open data by default, and made available with minimum time delay. It should be understandable in a way that allows researchers, including those outside the discipline of origin, to use them. This also needs to consider manageable and protected from loss for future use in sustainable, trustworthy repositories. And those Belmont Forum open data principles informed what was to become the DDOMP. This is the Data and Digital Outputs Management Plan. There are more background and instructions in the actual DDOMP, but this is just the general overview to ensure that the data is organized, shareable, and reproducible, helps researchers gain recognition and credibility through data sharing, and increases accessibility to research outcomes. DDOMP is required for all Belmont Forum funded projects and ensures the proper data management helps Belmont Forum researchers achieve the goal of supporting international transdisciplinary research to provide knowledge for understanding, mitigation, and adaptation to global environmental change, and again is required. So that's probably why you're watching the video. Just a quick review of what is a data management plan. Data management plan is a structured formal document describing the roles, responsibilities, and activities for managing data during and after research. A DDOMP includes both data and other digital outputs. So what does that mean? It could be quantitative and qualitative digital data created during research activities, all the metadata describing the data and digital outputs, any associated code, software, workflows, provenance information, and also stakeholder-oriented digital outputs such as maps, videos, white papers, and so forth. The DDOMP has a longer list, but those are some of the ones that you would be most familiar with. The purpose and use of the scorecard is threefold. It's an evaluation tool to quantitatively assess full proposal DDOMPs to questions drawn from the actual template that are included in Belmont Forum grant application process from BFGO. As a training resource to be shared with potential proposers to help define expectations for data management and or with awardees, so post-award or pre-award really, to help identify what are the elements that a DDOMP needs to include. It can also be used as an evaluation tool employed by the Secretariat or others to assess milestones and progress during a project, sort of a midpoint check or end of term project check. So as you can see today, you're probably using the scorecard just to assess a current data management plan from a funded project, but it can serve other purposes as well. For doing preparation of doing the scorecard, it helps to read through the scorecard, familiarize yourself with the criteria and scoring examples in the rubric. Another preparation step would be to read the entire data management plan or plans if you're reviewing multiple ones without any reference to the scorecard criteria. The purpose of that step is just to provide a mental gatepost, the range of responses in DMPs. There's a real variety to the order and the detail. So reading one all the way through will help you further down the line when you're scoring by criteria, because you'll know where in the DDOMP some of the things would appear. Reading all the way through also gives you a complete picture of the overall plan and perhaps some data elements that are not described in detail or absent. So it's a good idea to go through and make notes with a read through before using the scorecard. For actual evaluation, for each criterion, you assign points, 0, 1, or 2 only, no partial scoring in the column of score according to the rubric, which I'll go over in detail in just a few slides. The scorecard has a total of 16 elements. These all derive from elements required in the DDOMP, but sometimes not all criteria are necessary in a DDOMP depending on the data types that you have. So note the number of criteria that are applicable as well as the scores. And then at the end, simply you're counting the scores in the scorecard and dividing by the number of applicable criteria to arrive at a score. So once that's all been done, you calculate your score as a simple average and assign a score. Interpreting the score, an average score of 1 will or greater, hopefully, our criteria are addressed, even if incomplete. So all elements of the DDOMP are there, and that would be like a minimum. So anything less than an average of 1 means that some elements that are required are absent. More complete DDOMP with a maximum score average of 2 would be very detailed and have all of the elements thought through and explained in the DDOMP. For example, if the average over 16 applicable criteria is 1.2, then that is a complete DDOMP. It's covering all of the minimum expectations. If it's falling below that, perhaps another example with an average of over 14 applicable criteria, so 2 of the criteria are not applicable, but the average still is below 1, then that DDOMP will need more specific responses to address the required criteria. The DDOMP exists as a guideline, but this rubric created for the scorecard gives you specific examples so you know exactly what is expected with some specifics. So for the first question in the DDOMP, what types of data sets and other digital outputs of long-term value do you expect the project will produce? Long-term means those data and digital outputs that will or may be of value to others within your research community and the wider research community and even stakeholder communities. So long-term is well beyond the life of the project. Maybe not necessarily in perpetuity, but closer to that sort of expectation than the immediate. Here are the criteria. Criteria 1.1 in the scorecard plan lists the types of data and other digital outputs of long-term value. This can be simply listing them, explaining what they are, naming the data types by name, and being very specific about how the data are encoded. An incomplete response might refer to data sets or other digital outputs of long-term value, but lack detail for users beyond the project to understand. So not naming specific data types. Hopefully this is anticipated, what data types are going to be created, what open formats are going to be used. So those things can be simple, and you probably already know the answers, but some DDOMPs over the years will have these general responses which are incomplete. It would be much better to have more detail if you have it. So we know that you will probably have these answers. It's just providing those answers in the DDOMP to help in their evaluation. Throughout this example and the rest of the scorecard training, these are all actual quotes from DDOMPs that we've received. So it's a good example of a real world example of what something that's detailed versus something that's incomplete. And then of course, there's not examples for non-responses. And often if something is missed, that's a score of 0. So hopefully every criteria is at least addressed at some point, whether complete or incomplete. Criteria 1.2, plan describes how the data and other digital outputs will be collected, captured, or created. So this will, an example of a complete response would be clearly defines how data will be collected, captured, or created, including methods, instruments, software, or infrastructure where relevant. So that's all of the methodology you can speculate and provide that should be in your proposal anyways. Sometimes there's missing information, some details are not there. An example here, models will produce a broad range of output simulation data. Okay, that says that something will happen, but that's not really enough detail for any kind of reproducibility or even a vague understanding of what's happening. So the reviewer needs to be informed and as knowledgeable as possible with the details you can provide about how data will be collected, captured, or created. For criteria 1.3, the plan lists and quantifies how much data is anticipated, how much data are anticipated. Data sets and other digital outputs volume can be estimated. I know people will not know at the start of a project what exactly the number will be, but having some idea helps at least address that part of the DDOMP, that this has been thought through. An example that's incomplete, a new database will be made. Well, what is that? Is it, what is the size? Those are considerations that will help inform costs later down the road in your plans. So it does help to have a decent estimate of what the volume will be, the actual data quantified. DDOMP number 2. Question is, what supporting documentation and other information do you plan to make publicly accessible to support the longer term reuse of the data and digital outputs? Here's a simple criteria, 2.1. Plan specifically addresses metadata standards or formats for the data and other digital outputs. There's plenty of examples of widely adopted and used metadata. So as long as your metadata standard or format's named, that gets a complete response of a 2 score. Whether it's mentioning an ISO or a different metadata scheme that's specific to your discipline. An incomplete response would be a metadata standard format that's not named. So it says deliverables from the project will have keywords and appropriate metadata. Appropriate metadata is great. It's better than a 0, nothing at all. But we are hoping DDOMPs include enough detail to name metadata standards or formats. Criteria 2.2, plan describes when the data and other digital outputs will be made available outside and within the project team. Again, this is a plan, so plans sometimes change, but at least your initial plan can have a named time period of when the data will be made available outside the project team. So this example of a complete response 2 says, data generated from our research will be shared incrementally throughout the time period of the project, and the full data set will be available no later than 1 year after the project ends at a publication of our research. So that's an actual named time. An incomplete response, receiving a 1, would be something like this example, where it's fairly vague and there's not a specific time named. It will be the policy of the project to publish relevant findings expeditiously in the peer-reviewed literature. So expeditiously is not really saying, within 1 year or within a certain embargo time where that is actually named. Criteria 2.3 says plan describes how data and other digital outputs will be made available beyond the project team. This is very specific. A complete response names the data repository. So the data repository in this example is Dryad. There's many data repositories out there, discipline subjects with digital repositories of all kinds, depending on what's most relevant for your project. And parts of your project will likely have data in different repositories, but just naming them is a very good complete response. Indicating non-incomplete response would be saying that you will put stuff in a repository but not naming one. So not that one hasn't been identified, but just that this is a thought is an incomplete response is better than no response, but hopefully we're pushing for a complete response of a 2 where a data repository is actually named. DDOMP number 3, question is, which members of your team will be responsible for developing, implementing, overseeing, and updating the DDOMP? This is pretty straightforward. Criteria 3, plan describes which member or members of the team will be responsible for developing, implementing, overseeing, and updating the DDOMP. A complete response will have a name or at least define a role, who will be responsible for developing, implementing, overseeing, and updating the DDOMP. The data manager can be named in a proposal. Sometimes that's great if you already know who it will be, or at least the role exists in a proposal, and a full-time data manager will be sort of assigned. That is good. That is a complete response indicating this value of making data as open as possible and naming that in a proposal. An incomplete response would have a plan that indicates this role, but in vague qualifiers by multiple team people working independently or done passively. So data management approach during the project period will be the responsibility of each team's leader of data collection. So that's great for an initial draft, but that is an incomplete response, not being very specific in who will be responsible. If it is the team leader that is responsible, then name it that way. Not that there's something being delegated. DDOMP number 4, how do you intend to manage the data and digital outputs during the project to ensure their long-term value is protected? For example, where will the data be held during the project? Who will have access to it? And who will a specialized data manager be part of the project team? This DDOMP 4 translates to criteria 4. The plan describes the security measures to prevent unauthorized access to the data and other digital outputs. Data security refers to the process of protecting data from unauthorized access and data corruption throughout its life cycle. A complete response to criteria 4 would be the plan describes security measures for the data and other digital outputs to prevent unauthorized access with specific examples. So a data security plan that names these steps, whatever is actually happening to help controlled access to data. An incomplete response, the plan describes security measures for the data and other digital outputs to prevent unauthorized access, but in vague terms. So, for example, data will be stored on the secure research servers on the team's respective universities during the project. Okay, that's not wrong, but it's lacking the detail of a complete response. DDOMP question number 5, how and by whom will the data and other digital outputs be managed after the project ends to ensure their long-term accessibility? For criteria 5.1, the plan indicates how long the data and other digital outputs will be retained. The plan indicates the specific time frame for how long the data and other digital outputs will be retained would be a complete response. Here's some examples. These data will be stored for at least 10 years after the project has ended using the institutional infrastructure of, then they name the actual organization. A less complete response, an incomplete response, but still a response, is the plan would indicate how long the data and other digital object outputs would be retained, but with a vague time, including in perpetuity. This archive will be kept for at least several years. So that is not a great response to this question. It's better than no response, but you can see where this is an incomplete response because it's not actually giving a specific time frame, such as 10 years, 5 years, something like that. 5.2 criteria, plan indicates who will be responsible for managing data after the project ends to ensure their long-term accessibility. This is slightly different than who is managing it during the project. So for the complete response example, the plan indicates who or what entity will be responsible for managing after the project ends. The data manager will be responsible for developing, implementing, and updating the data management plan will ensure data are archived for permanent storage in a certified repository after our research. So in this instance, an example, it is the same person, but you must at least name the person. The plan indicates management of the data and digital outputs after the project ends, but in vague qualifiers is when it's not as really specific as naming who it will be. So project leads from each country will be responsible for ensuring long-term access to data from their country, although true, is lacking the specificity that actually is a more complete response for this criteria of the DDOMP. DDOMP number 6, what restrictions, if any, do you anticipate could be placed on how the data and digital outputs can be accessed, mined, or reused? This may not be applicable to every single project or even parts of projects. But if it is, if applicable, the DDOMP criteria in the scorecard 6.1 is the plan describes how sensitive data and other digital outputs will be made available beyond the project team. An example of a complete response, receiving a score of 2, the plan explains how sensitive data and other digital outputs will be made available outside the project team and outlines the specific considerations. Here's an example. Sensitive data, human identifiers, endangered species, and so forth will be anonymized before publication. A letter explaining the purpose, approach, and dissemination strategy of the research will be prepared, translated into the relevant languages, and shared with all participants in the event. That is very detailed. It provides a background on how the sensitive data are collected, but also how they'll be made available, and the participants are aware of how their data will be reused. An incomplete response would be the plan explains how sensitive data and other digital outputs will be made available beyond the project, but in a vague way. Here's an example from a real DDOMP. These data will be made available beyond the project team members only upon written request by qualified researchers. So that lacks a lot of specificity that the complete response has on the entire life cycle of that kind of data. A human subject's research can be made open if informed consent contains the language. So this is something to put into your plan for good research, and knowing that a DDOMP is required of Belmont Forum funded projects and that data should be as open as possible. It's not impossible to then put that into your research plan so the data can be shared at the end of the project. Criteria 6.2, if that's applicable, the plan describes any limitations on the ability to share data and other digital outputs. Obviously, there's some indigenous rights, proprietary nature of some data, so there are some limitations. We're trying to do as open as possible and know that some limitations still exist to access. A complete response example, receiving a score of 2 for 6.2, is the plan describes any limitations on the ability to share data and other digital outputs with detailed reasoning to limit access. Here's an example. In recognition of the important social, cultural, and ecological information being collected about and with local communities, we will also honor the principles of community-owned research, drawing on the OCAP principles developed by First Nation communities in Canada. There may be equivalent considerations in other institutions, other countries, so these are limitations that can be explained, and also direct reviewers of the DDOMP to links that show what limitations you're discussing and why. An incomplete response to this criteria would be the plan describes any limitations on the ability to share data and other digital outputs with vague terms and conditions. For example, our data will be accessible after the end of the project with a specific license on how to use them in both scientific and other contexts. Appropriate licensing will be selected to avoid or minimize misuse or overinterpretation of the results by non-informed people. So that is better than no response at all, but it's definitely a one and an incomplete response because it's not actually discussing the limitations with specific policies or guidelines that are being pointed to. DDOMP number 7, how will you ensure that any data security, privacy, and intellectual property restrictions associated with the data sets and digital outputs will be honored and preserved in derivative products? Here is criteria 7.1. The plan describes the intellectual property rights to the data and other digital outputs. A complete response receiving a score of 2 would have a plan that indicates the intellectual property rights of the data and other digital outputs in detail. So an example there would be the intellectual property rights relating to all project data analysis and outputs will be negotiated and specified in the consortium agreement and the data management plan. This is actually discussing the intellectual property rights in great detail. An incomplete response, the plan indicates the intellectual property rights to the data and other digital outputs in detail, but with vague terms, is provided this example. Public data are managed according to the highest standards available and will be available for reuse upon request in compliance with the data's reuse license. So that lacks some specificity or links to other terminology that would give a more complete response. For criteria 7.2, the plan describes licensing of the data and other digital outputs. In a complete response example, the plan describes licensing of the data and other digital outputs by naming a license. Although there are many licenses, CC BY here is provided. A Creative Commons license is just one example, and how data and other digital outputs could be licensed, naming the license. Incomplete response receiving a 1 would be the plan describes licensing of the data and other digital outputs, but in vague terms. So it might provide a general overview, but not anything specific, like actually indicating a license. So here's an example. Upon publication of our research, data will be accessible under open access and a specific license to avoid any misuse. That's better than a non-response or no response at all that does not indicate any licensing, but it doesn't name the actual license, which would be a more complete response for a DDOMP. DDOMP number 8, what supporting documentation, metadata do you plan to make publicly accessible to support the discovery and longer term reuse of the data and digital outputs? For that criteria, number 8 in the scorecard, the plan describes the supporting documentation and metadata that will be created to make data and digital outputs publicly accessible. A complete response would include supporting documentation and metadata on how to make data and digital outputs publicly accessible with specifics. Here's a very detailed example from a real DDOMP that names the website, this metadata schema that will be used, and a plan for the open access data publication and where it's going to be published. An incomplete response would be a plan that includes supporting documentation and other information on how to make data and digital outputs publicly accessible in vague detail. For example, here in our published results, we will provide supporting documentation that explain how the data were collected, provide an overview of data set contents and variables, and specify the point of contact for accessing the data. So again, it's lacking the naming of specific things, where things will be available, what process is used, what documentation is there. All of that is something that would make it a more complete response. An ideal DDOMP, all things that were applicable would be 2, and the score would be 2. Anything falling sort of below 1 needs to be revised because it's not addressing all of the parts of the DDOMP criteria. And that's where the scorecard can come in to be most useful, just to see if things are areas where the things can be improved. Finally, for DDOMP number 9, how have you accounted for the costs required to manage the data and digital outputs to ensure long-term accessibility? The plan specifies the costs of, or estimated costs associated with long-term data management and or assign the data manager role. So we know that it may be impossible to predict exactly how much something will cost, but just showing that indication that you know there will be some fiscal support for long-term data management and naming the funder gets you a complete response on this criteria and the scorecard. As a publicly funded authority, Organization X guarantees the long-term availability of the data through already existing institutional storage infrastructure, which also means we can account for costs of long-term storage of the data. That's a complete response. It says who's responsible and who's paying for the long-term data management. An incomplete response would be a plan that includes information on institutional, national, or other fiscal support for long-term data management, but in vague detail. So the costs of maintaining data to be collected are already taken care of outside the project through the respective affiliate institutions of the research team. Very general, not specific. So a response that's better than no response, but still an incomplete response, receiving a score of 1. For more information, you can contact Belmont Forum E-Infrastructure and Data Management Guide. It has details on full proposals. There's also a data management toolkit that was developed that has a lot of training materials, best practices, standards, and other training videos there. And you can contact info@belmontforum.org if you have other questions. Thank you for watching the video, and that is it.